Okay, welcome again, folks. So we are continuing our discussion of the so-called querelle des femmes, that is, the debate about women, which was going on from the 15th to the 18th centuries, and we see a little snippet of that debate within our text on early modern philosophy in this lovely book by Shapiro and Lascano, or edited by Shapiro and Lascano, as it were. So, we are looking at some lesser-known figures this week, but figures who, in various ways, had an impact. So, we're going to be looking at a 1673 work by Francois Poulain de la Barre. This fellow right here. Now, notice that if you see Poulain de la Barre, that's not the full last name. You can just call him Poulain. Just like how Thomas Hobbes sometimes gets referred to as Thomas Hobbes of Malmesbury. Well, the de la Barre is like of a city. So don't worry about using that as the last name. You can just call this philosopher Poulain. Poulain would eventually go on to have at least a little bit of influence. It seems that some other philosophers thinking about the woman question in the period were aware of Poulain's work. But maybe one of the most interesting ways in which his work filters through into the culture is that Poulain is quoted by the famous feminist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex. So some of these ideas that he's working on here would go on to influence, for instance, second wave feminism. So it's interesting to look at Poulain both as a certain individual in intellectual history, but as we'll also see, Poulain has some interesting arguments that might help us to think better about the equality of men and women, and also think about the ways that thinking and arguing were changing in the wake of certain advancements in early modern philosophy. Now, to give away the big idea right away for Poulain is that Poulain was arguing for equality between the sexes through the use of Cartesian arguments. That is, arguments influenced by the thinking of René Descartes. So here we're going to see that Descartes' ideas can be, once fully understood, readapted to argue against other certain problematic aspects of thinking in our society. So whereas Descartes gave us these arguments that, well, forget everything that you know, and then once you think hard, think clearly and distinctly, you're going to know that your mind is not your body, that God exists, and the material world exists in a particular and kind of interesting way for Descartes. But here we're going to see Poulain using Cartesian thinking to argue for an interesting version of proto-feminism, as it were. So, we're going to be looking at one of Poulain's pieces, Physical and Moral Discourse, concerning the equality of the sexes. So we're going to be looking at questions like, what is the nature of a prejudice? How can you approach questions free from prejudice? We're going to look at a very interesting examination of how custom and tradition can build up prejudices. And then we're going to look at Poulain's very interesting claim that the mind has no sex. That is, your mind in and of itself is not to be classed as male or female. And there, Poulain is giving both anatomical and metaphysical arguments. Not a whole lot is known about Poulain's life, but he was around from 1647 to 1723. Descartes, you might be interested to know, dies in about 1650. So he comes after Descartes, but not long after Descartes. Right. Poulain, like Descartes, received a scholastic education, that is, an old school Aristotelian Thomistic Catholic philosophical education when he was studying to enter the clergy. But after his education, Poulain discovers Descartes. Now we'll notice that, if he was born in 47 and wrote this in 73, by my math, that would make Poulain about 26 or 27 or 28 at the time of writing his moral discourse concerning the equality of the sexes. So part of what we're going to see here is, we've got a young person who, after receiving a scholastic education, finds Descartes and uses it to argue for this interesting and radical thesis. So how are we going to get an argument for the equality of men and women through Cartesian methods? Well, the first thing that Poulain is interested in is the idea, of prejudice. He points out people are convinced of innumerable things they cannot justify because their convictions are based only on superficial appearances. Let's take some examples, right? Some people become convinced that their sports team is definitely going to win this year, or that the members of that sports team are more virtuous and more excellent and more hardworking than all the other teams in the league. Right? Oftentimes these are based on superficial appearances. Or, think about another thing that people can often believe quite superficially is that certain makes of cars are good and certain makes of cars are bad. Right? So some people will not have actually done the research to figure out how much better, assuming, a Honda is than a Kia, or whether what was true about Hondas and Kias 10 years ago is still true now. Oftentimes, people will believe things based on, stuff like what their parents told them. So for instance, I was brought up in my family believing that Fords are not good cars. And apparently, my dad had a Ford that did not treat him well, and my dad's dad had a Ford that didn't work well. But by the time the belief gets to me, I don't even have evidence of these two bad vehicles. I just receive this prejudice that Fords are not good vehicles. Right? And we might say that insofar as I used to believe that, I would think that I don't really have a strong opinion about how much better Fords are or how much worse they are than other cars. What I used to believe was based on a pretty superficial appearance. And Poulain's also going to note that if you examine the foundation of various beliefs, now of course one belief that he's going to examine is the question of the nature of men versus the nature of women. He's going to say we'll often find that these beliefs are based on self-interest and custom. And he says this: when I examine the opinion that women are inferior to men by applying the criterion of truth, which is not to accept anything as true unless it is based on clear and distinct ideas, I came to two conclusions. First conclusion, that it's false to believe that women are inferior. And two, the reason why people believe it in the first place is based on prejudice. That is, we're looking at things superficially and not clearly and distinctly. But here we can see a way of using Cartesian approaches, right? Because Descartes basically says the way we make error is by letting our will, our desire to assert things in a certain way, to outrun our understanding. And we might say, if you just take an opinion, that the Edmonton Oilers are a great hockey team, or the opinion that Fords are not good vehicles, oftentimes those are just handed down to you from your family. You haven't really fully thought these things through. And instead of thinking superficially, Poulain is recommending that we use clear and distinct ideas. If you've been following along with Descartes, this is exactly what Descartes says. Set everything that you believe aside and then don't re-believe it. Don't put it back on the table until you're absolutely certain that it's true. And you can do that by thinking clearly and distinctly. That is, think about things according to their right category and think in terms of what has to be true. So the argument that women are inferior to men, he says this comes out of a false concept of custom. The custom that says if a practice is well established, then we must think it's right. Now, people do this all the time, right? They say, well, this many people can't be wrong, or we've been doing this for this many years, so there must be something to it. Well, Poulain is going to say that that's clearly a mistake. Just because women have had subordinate roles in many cultures for many centuries doesn't necessarily justify that inequitable social practice. So here's maybe the weird part of Poulain's argument. He goes into what I'm going to call a conjectural history. Right? You find these conjectural histories throughout early modern philosophy. So for instance, when you look at Hobbes's argument about the state of nature, or Locke's reinterpretation of the state of nature, Hume and his story about where our concept of justice comes from, or Rousseau thinking about how we leave the life of savagery, right? We get all these conjectural histories, which are basically stories about society and where it comes from. And here's the story that Poulain imagines is true. He says, early human history, men and women did equal work and were equally respected for their contributions. So in that sense, men's superior strength in, say, like muscle mass was once trivial. But once women's contributions were interrupted by pregnancy and child rearing and child care, made them less able to go out and hunt, be productive. That led to dependence of women on men. Once we start dividing the labor like this, women get roles at home, but then they're excluded from professions. So Poulain points out, this is why women were excluded from attending universities or becoming scientists. And once we do that, then honors and distinctions are another thing that women are excluded from. So yeah, she points out that the study of science requires leisure. If women are busy looking after domestic problems, then women will not be invited to academies, that is, universities. He says, given the incentive structures, it's not very surprising, Poulain thinks, that women pursue things that are, as he puts it, more frivolous, things like fashion. So Poulain points out that these appointments of men are not based on reason, right? Men are appointed to various civil offices only by chance. Why does somebody end up in a job? Poulain thinks oftentimes it's because it's the job that their dad did. Or just because we needed somebody to fill a role, or that somebody takes a role out of self-interest. And Poulain wonders if this is how roles in society are set up. He wonders how many people remain impoverished who would have become distinguished had they been given a little encouragement. So the general story that we're getting here is that the reason why certain people do not end up in positions of power or authority or renown, it's not because people who do not end up in these roles lack the capability. Rather, it's just that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time or ended up in a society that happened to exclude them. And that we could have more achievement and more excellence if we had given people a little bit of encouragement. So we get this line of thought in Poulain. that the reason why women have achieved less is because they've been excluded from situations in which they could achieve things. In fact, de Gournay, though employing different argumentative strategies, makes a similar claim, that the reason why men have excelled more than women in society up to that point is because women were excluded from things like high-quality educations. Now, we might pull back here and ask which of these claims is most plausible and which is least. So, is there this simple idea that women's strength was not a big deal in maybe an early history of mankind? And how simple is this story about the interruptions of pregnancy? I left some things out of these notes. He also talks about envy of brothers and women being traded as property when households break up and conquest happens through war. We might also wonder whether Poulin's argument is ruined if you don't believe certain steps in the argument. Now, one thing that we might note is maybe Poulain should be arguing here that this conjecture that he's giving as a history doesn't necessarily have to be true. Maybe all he needs to say is that this story about the difference between men and women could be true, and reason does not rule out this story any more than a number of other stories. But in this way, this line of thought could still undercut the idea that there is a natural superiority of men over women. If we tell a story like this one, then we can say, look, you can have socially created roles of inferiority and superiority rather than a natural hierarchy between people. So this is going to be the strategy for fighting prejudice. In fact, he says that this first line of argument is going to be against what common people think. And the way to argue against what common people think is not to counter their arguments because they don't really have any. They've just gone with superficial appearances. Well, we should look closer at superficial appearances and try to find ways to unsettle them a bit. Second line of thought that Poulain gives, he says, is going to be directed at scholars. So perhaps scholastic followers of Thomas Aquinas, who would say, for instance, that there is more of human nature in men. Aristotle and Aquinas seem to make these claims in places. Well, Poulain here is going to argue for the claim that the mind has no sex. So when he says that the mind has no sex, he's basically saying that sex differentiation is a feature of your body, and it's not a feature of your mind. So he says, if you think about a mind in and of itself, it is found to be equal and to have the same nature in all human beings and to be capable of every kind of thought. Now, this is a very Cartesian line of thought, where Descartes told us that what kind of thing am I? Well, I am a thinking thing, a thing that doubts, denies, wills, understands, senses. These are activities of the mind. So Descartes is saying that, well, to be a mind is to engage in the process of thought. And, to engage in thinking or understanding or willing, Poulain is going to argue that there's no inherent sex involved in that. In fact, the thing that makes you male or female, according to Poulain, is just your body, which is not your mind and it's not yourself, if we are good students of Descartes. So, the thought here is going to be that if women have minds that are fundamentally the same kind of thing as the minds of men, then the minds of women are not subordinate by nature. So the substance that is the mind is this thing that has various modes, thinking, feeling, willing, but those are not gendered. So, Poulain says, what would prevent women from reflecting on their own selves to examine the nature of their mind? What would prevent them from subsequently examining the natural ideas they have of God and organizing their thoughts in an orderly fashion? Well, this rhetorical question has an answer. When you see rhetorical questions in philosophy, try to be almost deliberate and aggressive in saying, well, what are we supposed to answer this question with? And Poulain is going to say, look, nothing would prevent women from reflecting on themselves and the nature of the mind. So a woman could read the Meditations and get the same thing out of them that a man does, right? What would prevent them from examining the natural ideas that they have of God and organizing them in an orderly fashion? Again, that's something that women can and have done. So we might think that this distinctively special thing that human beings do, which is like philosophize and do metaphysics, there's no reason to bar that activity from women, because a female mind is just like a male mind. Poulain also makes what he's going to call an anatomical argument. So he says, like, think about the differences between men's and women's bodies. It is true that men have things like beards and testicles. Women don't have beards, at least they don't have nearly as much facial hair as people assigned male at birth. But there are differences. There are differences between male and female bodies, the way that Poulain is thinking about it. But he's going to say, when it comes to how your mind interacts with your body, he's going to say, the mind and the body are united in the same way in men and women, right? So if you look at the anatomy of a male head and the anatomy of a female head, the way that the mind and body interact is going to be the same. Poulain says there's nothing special in the disposition of women's sensory organs apart from the fact that those of women are usually more delicate, which is to their advantage. Strange claim here. It's unclear to me whether he thinks that women have more delicate hearing and sensing and smelling than men, as a matter of how they've been socialized, or if it's just built into them. But he is going to say that the ability to sense the world is fundamentally doing the same kinds of things in men and women, and that the anatomical functioning is about the same. So, if you are a surgeon who works on people's eardrums, let's say, it's not like you have to learn how to do surgery on a male eardrum and then a female eardrum. Basically, men and women will have similar kinds of eardrums, and they will function in the same kinds of ways. Now, I think that we should maybe step back here and note that there are similarities and differences between Poulain's idea here in contemporary feminism. One would be, and this would be a similarity, is the line of thought that says, look, there is no inherent natural difference between men and women. So, these lines of thought that you'll sometimes hear, that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Well, this is mistaken. It's a bad line of thinking to think that men and women have fundamentally different kinds of natures. To the extent that there are differences, maybe different levels of sensitivity, those differences are far more trivial than the similarities. The capability of men and women to think the same kinds of thoughts, to do metaphysics, to be rational. Right. But we should also notice, Poulain's argument does not do a great job, in my view, of recognizing a distinction that's quite common in contemporary feminism, and that's the distinction between sex and gender. So it seems like Poulain is right on target with thinking about sex differentiation. That's a biological concept, and it would involve looking at, say, a person's chromosomes. That is, like, males will be XY, females will be XX, and that will have different anatomical features, right? So males, biologically speaking, will typically have beard development or testicles, that women will have, for instance, more breast development or a uterus. Now, we will acknowledge that there are complications, and that biological sexuality is not a simple binary, but there are cases of intersex people. But with all this said, contemporary feminism does recognize that there are bodily, anatomical, biological differences between men and women. But contemporary feminism also says that minds have genders. Right. So sometimes you will hear, as a simple slogan explaining the difference between sex and gender, is that, sex is in your pants or it's in your chromosomes, whereas gender is your understanding of how you feel and how you identify, and other certain perceptions, understandings of certain social roles in society. And in that way, we might say, like, look, maybe the mind does have a gender. And we might wonder if maybe Poulin's argument places too much emphasis on the idea that sex differentiation is only a bodily thing, and that the mind has no sex to it at all. But we might think that there are ways in which Poulin's argument could be a helpful starting point, especially as a way of arguing against people who think that there are inherent differences between men and women. Although I wonder if there are problems in claiming that, your soul does not have any gender to it. I think a lot of people might dispute that claim, and for some good reasons. It's harder to understand our experience of the world if we don't give gender a mental aspect. But just to recap, Poulain argues for the equality of men and women by borrowing two central Cartesian ideas. The first is withhold judgment and avoid prejudice. So you should only believe something if you can perceive it clearly and distinctly. And Poulain gives us this conjectural history used to undercut the naturalness of hierarchy in society. And then we also see from Poulain the usage of mind-body dualism, this Cartesian idea that the mind is one kind of thing and the body is another kind of thing, and that they can exist fully independently from one another. And Poulain is going to use this to argue that the essence of the mind is no different across the sexes. And Poulain will also argue that if we have differences in achievement, that's going to be socially explainable rather than naturally explainable. So why have women written fewer great philosophical texts? It might be asked. Well, Poulain would respond that women have been excluded from the universities up to his time. So I'd invite you, in light of our look at de Gournay, who made some appeal to authority arguments, that if you were a good reader of the Bible or a good reader of Plato, you need to accept the equality of women. You'll also notice that de Gournay makes similar arguments about exclusion and education. But I will leave it to you to consider some of the differences between Poulain and de Gournay, and I'll invite you to wonder, have we made a step forward in arguing for feminism by using mind-body dualism? We might also wonder whether we can make just as good of an argument for feminism without using mind-body dualism. Could it be that we could argue against a natural hierarchy of men and women while acknowledging that each individual is not a mind-body union, that's the Descartes view, but maybe a fancy material object? That would be the materialist view, more like Hobbes. Could we argue for equality even if we denied the truth of mind-body dualism? I'll leave that for you to consider. And in fact, the next time you'll see a video from me, I will be making one about Hobbesian arguments for equality between people. So, thanks for listening today, and stay tuned for that next discussion. Take care. Thank you.